What happens when the voices that inspire millions are hiding battles no one sees? Two men, same stage, different demons. One fighting a bottle that almost destroyed everything he built. The other silently drowning in anxiety while thousands cheered his every note. This is the story you've never heard about the Gaither Vocal Band's most powerful voices. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why their struggles made their music unforgettable. I'm going to reveal 3 life-changing lessons from their journeys that most people completely miss. Stay until the end because the third one will challenge everything you thought you knew about faith and vulnerability. Before Russ Taff became a Grammy-winning legend, he was a broken man standing in his kitchen at 3 a.m., staring at an empty bottle and wondering if he'd ever sing again. But here's what most people don't understand about Russ's journey with the Imperials. By 1976, he had become the lead singer of one of Christian music's most respected vocal groups. His voice, that incredible soulful instrument, took them to heights they'd never reached. The Grammys came, the Dove Awards piled up, critics ran out of superlatives, but behind every standing ovation was a man medicating childhood wounds with alcohol. Behind every perfect note was someone who felt fundamentally inadequate, despite all evidence to the contrary. The same voice that brought healing to thousands was crying out for help that never seemed to come. And this is where we encounter our first major lesson. Success doesn't heal internal pain. In fact, it often amplifies it. Think about that for a moment. We assume that achievement and recognition will somehow fill the holes inside us. But Russ Taff's story exposes this lie in the most painful way possible. The bigger his success grew, the louder the demons became. Every award was followed by a drink. Every tour was punctuated by hotel room battles with bottles. And, the worst part? He had to keep performing. He had to keep showing up. Because thousands of people were counting on that voice, on that anointing, on that gift. In 1981, Russ walked away from the Imperials. The official story was creative differences and financial disputes, but the real story was that Russ was falling apart. The addiction he'd managed to keep semi-functional was starting to consume everything. The mask was cracking, so he walked away from the group that had made him a star and stepped into a solo career, carrying all his demons with him. Here's where most comeback stories would tell you that hitting bottom led to immediate redemption. But when Russ went solo, the acclaim actually continued. Critics loved him even more. His fan base expanded. From the outside, it looked like leaving the Imperials was the best decision he ever made. But inside, the war was intensifying. This is the part most highlight reels skip over. The years where Russ Taff was simultaneously at the peak of his artistic powers and the depths of his personal hell. He was creating some of the most moving, anointed music of his career, while barely able to function off stage. He was singing about God's grace, while feeling utterly graceless himself. And the addiction was tightening its grip. Alcoholism doesn't care about your Grammy nominations. It doesn't care about your calling. It just consumes until there's nothing left. Let me tell you what those dark years actually looked like. The mornings when Russ would wake up and not remember the night before. The commitments he couldn't keep because he was too drunk to function. The moments of clarity where he'd see what he was becoming and feel such profound self-loathing that the only relief was another drink. The prayers that felt like they bounced off the ceiling. The growing sense that he was beyond redemption, beyond help, beyond hope. Now, this is where Wes Hampton's perspective becomes crucial to understanding the full story. When Wes joined the Gaither Vocal Band in 2005, Russ had already left the group a year earlier in 2004. But the impact of Russ's time with the Gaither Vocal Band, and more importantly, his honesty about his struggles, had created ripples that were still being felt. Wes entered a space that Russ had helped make safer for vulnerability. You see, when Russ joined the Gaither Vocal Band in 2001, something had fundamentally changed in him. He wasn't hiding anymore. The years of addiction had nearly destroyed him, but they'd also stripped away his ability to maintain pretense. He brought not just his incredible voice, but his story. The real story about alcoholism and childhood trauma, and feeling worthless despite all the awards. And what Russ did during those 3 years with the Gaither Vocal Band was revolutionary. His voice, which had always been powerful, took on a different quality. When he sang about grace, people didn't just hear it, they felt it, because they could hear the scars. They could hear someone who had walked through fire and come out on the other side. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was testimony in its purest form. Every note carried the weight of his journey. Every lyric was infused with hard-won wisdom. But here's what Wes Hampton witnessed from a distance, and later experienced firsthand. Russ's honesty about his battles created permission for others to be honest about theirs. When Wes stepped into the Gaither Vocal Band just 1 year after Russ left, he was walking into an environment that had been transformed by Russ's vulnerability. But Wes was carrying his own invisible battles. Anxiety, depression, the kind that grips your chest before you walk on stage, the kind that whispers lies while thousands of people are telling you how anointed you are. Imagine standing backstage, moments before walking out in front of thousands. Your heart is racing with terror, not excitement. Your hands are shaking. There's a voice in your head listing every way this could go wrong, every way you could fail. And you can't tell anyone because you're supposed to be the encouraging one. How can you admit that right now, in this moment, you can barely breathe? But Wes had watched what Russ's honesty had accomplished. He'd seen how Russ's willingness to be vulnerable about addiction had opened doors for real conversation about real struggles. And Wes made a choice that would define his ministry. He decided to speak up about his mental health battles. In gospel music circles, mental health struggles weren't discussed openly. Admitting them could end careers, could make people question whether you should really be in ministry. But Wes spoke up anyway. And here's the second lesson that connects directly to what Russ had modeled. Vulnerability isn't weakness. It's the bridge to authentic connection. When Wes started being honest about his struggles with anxiety and depression, people didn't turn away. They leaned in. Because for every one person performing on stage, there are thousands in the audience fighting the same battles in silence. When Wes admitted that he wrestled with anxiety before performances, countless other performers felt permission to acknowledge their own struggles. When he talked about depression, people who had been suffering alone realized they weren't alone. Wes saw what Russ had done by being honest about addiction and realized that mental health struggles needed the same kind of courageous vulnerability. The connection between Russ and Wes isn't just that they both sang with the Gaither Vocal Band. It's that they both understood something profound about ministry. They both recognized that their brokenness, their struggles, their ongoing battles weren't disqualifications. They were credentials. Russ showed that you could be anointed and addicted. That grace meets us in the mess, not after we've cleaned ourselves up. Wes showed that you could be called and anxious. That faith doesn't mean the absence of struggle. That God's presence doesn't always remove the battle but sustains you through it. And this brings us to that third lesson I promised you, the one that challenges everything. Your brokenness might be exactly what qualifies you. Russ Taff's voice carries the weight and authority it does, precisely because it's been weathered by battle. The emotion, the depth, the authenticity that makes people stop and really listen comes from someone who has been to hell and back. Wes Hampton's ministry has the reach and impact it does, precisely because he's fighting alongside the people he's serving. He's not speaking from a place of having conquered all mental health challenges. He's speaking from the trenches, saying, I'm in this fight too, and here's what's helping me, and you're not alone. What Wes Hampton has finally broken his silence about is how profoundly Russ Taff's example impacted his own journey toward vulnerability. Wes has spoken about how watching Russ be honest about his darkest struggles gave him permission to be honest about his own. How seeing someone as talented and anointed as Russ admit to being broken showed Wes that authenticity and ministry weren't opposites, but partners. How Russ's willingness to let his voice carry the scars of his journey taught Wes that the most powerful ministry comes not from perfection, but from honest struggle. This is what makes their connection so significant. They represent two different generations of gospel artists, two different types of struggles, but the same fundamental choice. Do you hide and preserve your image, or do you tell the truth and risk everything? Russ chose truth when it could have cost him his career. He talked about alcoholism in spaces where addiction was seen as moral failure rather than medical crisis. He admitted to childhood trauma in contexts where everyone wanted testimonies of complete victory. He showed his wounds when everyone expected him to display trophies. And in doing so, he created space for someone like Wes to do the same thing with mental health struggles. Wes has become an active advocate for mental health awareness, partnering with organizations that specialize in support and speaking at events focused on breaking down stigma in faith communities. But what he credits, what he's finally speaking openly about, is how Russ Taff's courage paved the way for his own. How seeing Russ continue to minister, continue to sing, continue to serve, while being honest about ongoing recovery, showed Wes that you don't have to wait until you're fixed to be honest. You don't have to have complete victory before you share your story. You can be in the middle of the battle and still point people toward hope. The Gaither Vocal Band itself becomes a powerful symbol in this story. It's not just a group of talented singers. It's a collection of broken people who have chosen to harmonize their struggles into something beautiful. Harmony doesn't mean everyone sings the same note. It means different voices with different ranges coming together to create something more beautiful than any single voice could achieve alone. And that's what happens when we're willing to be honest about our struggles, when we stop pretending we have it all together. When we let our brokenness be seen, we create space for harmony. Instead of solo performances that leave everyone isolated, Bill Gaither created an environment where artists can be human, where perfection isn't the requirement, where the mission is to point people toward God's grace, and sometimes that happens most powerfully through broken vessels. In this context, voices like Russ Taff's and Wes Hampton's don't just entertain, they minister, they encourage, they remind us that we're not alone. What Wes is emphasizing now, what he's finally speaking openly about, is that Russ's legacy isn't just in his Grammy Awards or his vocal performances. It's in the permission he gave an entire generation of gospel artists to be honest about their struggles. Think about the ripple effects of Russ's courage. When he started being honest about his addiction, how many other people in ministry felt permission to admit their own struggles? How many families affected by alcoholism found hope in knowing that recovery was possible? How many people trapped in shame found relief in knowing they weren't alone? And then Wes took that torch and ran with it into the mental health conversation. When Wes started advocating for mental health awareness, how many people realized that anxiety and depression weren't spiritual failures? How many others in ministry felt permission to seek help? This is the multiplication effect of vulnerability. One person's courage to be honest gives others courage. What makes Wes's breaking of silence about Russ so powerful is that it's not just admiration from a distance. It's acknowledgement of direct impact. Wes is saying that without Russ's example, he might not have found the courage to be honest about his own battles. That Russ's willingness to be vulnerable about addiction made the path safer for Wes, to be vulnerable about mental health. That the legacy we leave isn't always in our greatest achievements, but in the permission we give others to be authentic. Russ didn't just sing beautifully, he sang honestly. And that honesty became a blueprint for how ministry could be done differently. Both men demonstrate that faith doesn't mean the absence of struggle. Faith means trusting God even when you're falling apart. Russ showed that you can be in recovery and in ministry simultaneously. That you don't have to wait until you've been sober for a certain number of years before you're qualified to serve. That your journey toward healing can be your ministry. Wes showed that you can manage mental health challenges and answer a calling. That therapy and medication aren't signs of weak faith but tools for maintaining health. That you can be both struggling and serving. The authenticity they both brought to their roles in the Gaither Vocal Band transformed their music from performance into ministry. When Russ sang, you heard someone who understood desperation and grace in equal measure. When Wes sings, You hear someone who knows what it's like to fight invisible battles while standing in visible light. Their voices carry weight because they're rooted in real experience. Every note, every lyric is infused with the authenticity of people who have struggled with suffering but chosen not to let it define them completely. What Wes wants people to understand about Russ Taff is that his greatest gift to gospel music wasn't his incredible voice, though that voice is truly once in a generation. His greatest gift was his honesty, his willingness to let people see behind the curtain, his courage to admit that even Grammy winners struggle, even anointed singers battle addiction, even people who lead thousands in worship need help themselves. And in giving that gift of honesty, Russ made it possible for people like Wes to do the same with their own struggles. This is why their stories matter so much beyond just biographical interest. They represent a fundamental shift in how we think about ministry and authenticity. For too long, the message in faith communities was that you needed to have your act together before you could help anyone else. That struggles disqualified you, that until you achieved complete victory, you had nothing to offer. But Russ and Wes both prove that the opposite is true. Your struggles, when handled with honesty and courage, become your most powerful credentials. Your wounds, when you're willing to share them, become sources of healing for others. The practical implications of this are enormous. If you're struggling with addiction like Russ did, his story teaches that you're not disqualified. Your struggle doesn't mean God has abandoned you. Recovery is possible, but requires honesty, help, and daily commitment. Your calling doesn't disappear because of addiction, but you do need to get help. You do need to stop hiding. You do need to let people in. And when you do, you might discover that your greatest ministry comes not despite your struggle, but because of what you learned through it. If you're battling mental health challenges like Wes has, his story teaches that you're not spiritually deficient. Mental health struggles are real medical issues that require real help. There's no shame in therapy or medication. You can be anointed and anxious, called and depressed, used by God while still struggling. What Wes is emphasizing in breaking his silence about Russ is that we need more people willing to be this honest. We need more artists willing to let their voices carry the scars of their journeys. We need more ministers willing to admit they don't have it all together. Because when leaders are vulnerable, it creates permission for everyone else to be vulnerable too. And in that space of mutual vulnerability, real healing happens. Real community forms. Real transformation occurs. Wes credits Russ with showing him what courageous vulnerability looks like in practice. Not just talking about past struggles in past tense, but being honest about ongoing battles, ongoing recovery, ongoing growth. The gospel music legacy that both men have contributed to is one that values authenticity over perfection. That recognizes the most powerful testimonies often come from people still in the fight. That understands grace isn't just for salvation, but for the messy process of sanctification. Their voices, both literally and figuratively, have enriched the gospel music world by reminding us that beneath polished performances are deeply human stories of adversity, resilience, and faith that doesn't quit even when everything hurts. So here's what Wes Hampton wants you to understand about Russ Taff's impact. It's not just that Russ was an incredible singer, though he absolutely was. It's not just that he won awards and achieved success, though he did. It's that Russ was brave enough to be broken in public. He was courageous enough to admit that success hadn't fixed him, that fame hadn't healed him, that even Grammy Awards couldn't fill the holes addiction was born from. And in being that honest, in being that vulnerable, Russ gave permission to an entire generation of gospel artists to do the same. Wes is part of that generation, and now Wes is doing for mental health awareness what Russ did for addiction recovery, creating space for honest conversation about struggles that have been hidden for too long. The world doesn't need more perfect performances from people who appear to have it all together. The world needs more authentic testimonies from people willing to harmonize their brokenness into beauty. It needs more voices like Russ Taff and Wes Hampton, voices that carry the weight of real struggle and real grace, voices that remind us we're not alone in the fight. That's the legacy. That's the impact. That's why Wes Hampton is finally breaking his silence about how profoundly Russ Taff's courage shaped his own journey toward vulnerability and authentic ministry. So, here's my final challenge to you. What's the one thing you've been hiding that might be exactly what someone else needs to hear? What's the struggle you're convinced disqualifies you that might actually be your greatest credential? What's the wound you're trying to cover up that might become the source of healing for others? Think about it. Pray about it. And when you're ready, find someone safe and start being honest. Because the world doesn't need more perfect performances. It needs more authentic testimonies. It needs more people willing to harmonize their brokenness into beauty. It needs more voices like Russ Taff and Wes Hampton. Voices that carry the weight of real struggle and real grace. Voices that remind us we're not alone in the fight. Thanks for sticking with me through this entire journey into the lives and ministries of these two remarkable men. If their stories impacted you the way they've impacted me, share this with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment telling me which lesson resonated most deeply with you. And subscribe because we're going to keep diving into the untold stories behind the voices that have shaped gospel music. The stories of real people with real struggles choosing to let God use them anyway. Remember, the most beautiful harmonies don't come from perfect voices. They come from broken people, brave enough to sing anyway.